All men are created equal. These immortal words, penned in the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, stood as the bedrock of a new nation, the United States of America. A nation that promised liberty, dignity, and the pursuit of happiness to all its people. Yet, from the very moment those words were etched into history, they rang hollow for millions. Because the men who declared freedom from British tyranny upheld another form of tyranny back home. A nation founded on liberty was also a nation built on slavery. And it is in that contradiction between soaring ideals and brutal reality that the American Civil War was born. A war where brothers turned rifles on one another, where cities burned and fields ran red, where America had to nearly destroy itself to become what it claimed to be. Why did a nation that triumphed over colonial oppression descend into a war so savage, so consuming, that it remains the bloodiest in its history? And what legacy did it leave behind? This is not just a story of battlefields, it is the story of a country wrestling with its soul. Historical setup, the timeline. In the late 18th century, as the American colonies declared independence and forged a new republic, they inherited not only British institutions but also British injustices, chief among them, slavery. For generations, enslaved Africans were shipped by the millions to North America, torn from their homes, stripped of their families, and forced into brutal labor on southern plantations. In the land of the free, they were property, tools, assets. They could be bought, sold, beaten, raped, or killed with no rights and no recourse. By the early 1800s, the U.S. economy had splintered into two starkly different systems. In the North, industrialization was accelerating. Factories, railroads, and free labor markets were transforming cities and fueling a capitalist economy. In the South, however, the plantation economy reigned supreme, dependent entirely on slave labor. It wasn't just an economic divide. It was a moral, cultural, and political chasm. As America expanded westward through land purchases, treaties, and wars, each new territory had to decide, would it allow slavery? With every new state, the delicate balance of power between free states and slave states was tested. By 1837, there were 26 states, 13 free, 13 slave, a perfect, fragile balance, but one that couldn't hold forever. Westward expansion turned the U.S. into a battlefield of ideologies. Every acre of new land became a point of contention. Slaveholders wanted the South's power preserved. Northern abolitionists saw a chance to end what they viewed as a national sin. By the mid-19th century, political tensions ignited. In 1854, anti-slavery activists formed a new political force, the Republican Party. They quickly gained support in the North, challenging the Democratic Party, which largely defended slavery. The Republicans weren't all abolitionists, but they believed the institution should not expand. To them, slavery was incompatible with a modern capitalist society and a direct threat to the unity and moral foundation of the nation. Deep analysis, the spark of war. Then came the election of 1860. The Republican candidate, a tall, rail-thin lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, won the presidency without a single electoral vote from the South. To slave-holding elites, his election was not just a political defeat, it was an existential threat. Though Lincoln promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, Southern leaders didn't trust him. They saw in his victory the beginning of their end. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina declared secession from the Union. Within weeks, 6 other states followed. By February 1861, these breakaway states formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. To the North, secession was treason. The Union, they argued, was perpetual. The South could not simply walk away. When Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in April 1861, Lincoln responded by calling for 75 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The American Civil War had begun. Both sides believed it would be quick. They were wrong. The North had the numbers, more people, more factories, more railroads, but the South had the will, the generals, and the advantage of fighting on home ground. Lincoln's war aims at first were simple: preserve the Union. But the deeper moral question, slavery, was never far from the surface, and as the war dragged on, it became impossible to avoid. The war escalates. Blood and turning points. The first major clash came at Bull Run, Virginia, in July 1861. Civilians picnicked on hillsides to watch, imagining a quick Northern victory. Instead, Union forces were routed. The shocking Confederate success shattered illusions on both sides. It would not be a short war, it would be a bloodletting. Lincoln and his generals responded with the Anaconda Plan, a grand strategy to strangle the South through a naval blockade, control of the Mississippi River, and a push toward the Confederate capital, Richmond. But reality proved messier. The Union suffered setbacks, political divisions, and internal doubts. In the West, one Union general began to stand out: Ulysses S. Grant. Gruff, relentless, and reportedly fond of whiskey, Grant delivered key victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh, showing the North could, at great cost, win battles. Yet in the East, the Confederacy held its ground. In 1862, General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, emerged as the South's strategic genius. Lee struck quickly, pushing Union forces away from Richmond in the Peninsula Campaign, then seizing the initiative with a bold invasion of the North. In September 1862, Lee crossed into Maryland with hopes of sparking rebellion in the border states and gaining European recognition. But his plans fell into Union hands literally. A soldier found a copy of his marching orders wrapped around cigars. With this intelligence, Union forces under General George McClellan confronted Lee near Antietam Creek. What followed on September 17, 1862, was a single day of unimaginable carnage. Over 23,000 casualties, the bloodiest day in American military history. Though tactically inconclusive, Antietam gave Lincoln something he desperately needed: a strategic win to shift the war's moral center. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The war for freedom begins. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. It declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It did not free a single slave in the loyal border states. It was not a law passed by Congress, and it could not be enforced in areas still under Confederate control. But symbolically, it changed everything. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union, it was now about ending slavery. It dissuaded foreign powers, especially Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy. It energized abolitionists, and it allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 200 African American soldiers and sailors would fight for their freedom, many dying in the process. The South, meanwhile, responded with fury. Confederate leaders doubled down, and Lee prepared another offensive push to bring the war to the North. In July 1863, Lee marched into Pennsylvania, hoping a decisive victory would turn the tide. He met Union forces at a quiet town called Gettysburg. For 3 days, July honest to 3 fields of Gettysburg became a slaughterhouse. Over 50 men fell. The climactic moment came on the 3rd day, when Lee ordered pickets charge a massive assault across open ground into the heart of Union defenses. It was a disaster. The Confederate Army was shattered and forced to retreat. The North, at last, had its turning point. That same month, in the West, Grant captured Vicksburg, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. The twin Union victories Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked a decisive shift. From here, the North would slowly squeeze the life from the South. But the end was still 2 years away. The final phase, a nation in fire. With the South reeling from Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Union pressed its advantage. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies. His strategy was straightforward, brutal, and relentless. Fight, advance, and never let up. No more retreats, no more pauses. Grant's aim was not simply to defeat Confederate armies, it was to grind them down piece by piece and destroy their capacity to wage war. In the East, Grant launched a brutal campaign against Lee's forces in Virginia. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor turned forests into graveyards. The casualty lists stretched into the tens of thousands, but Grant kept going. At the same time, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through the heart of the South. His infamous March to the Sea would become legend. Starting from Atlanta City, he burned Sherman cut a path of destruction through Georgia, tearing up railroads, destroying crops, seizing livestock. He called it hard war, meant to break the Confederacy's will. In truth, it was psychological warfare on a national scale. Town by town, state by state, the South was being carved open. Lincoln, exhausted but resolute, stood for re-election in 1864. His prospects seemed bleak. War fatigue was rising and casualties were staggering. But Sherman's capture of Atlanta turned the tide, and Lincoln won decisively. In his second inaugural address, he did not speak of vengeance, but of healing. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds. Yet fate would not grant him the time. A president's blood, a nation's mourning. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The war, at least militarily, was over. But just 5 days later, the unthinkable happened. On the night of April 14, as Lincoln sat watching a play at Ford's Theater, he was shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer. The president died the next morning. The man who had preserved the Union and ended slavery was dead, the first U.S. president ever to be assassinated. Lincoln's funeral train traveled for 3 weeks through towns and cities across the North. Crowds lined the tracks in silence. They wept, they saluted, they stood with hands over hearts. The North had not merely lost a president, it had lost its moral compass. Legacy, a nation reborn, a wound unhealed. After the war, the Union passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery in all its forms. No more compromises, no exceptions. Freedom finally had the force of law. But the road ahead was anything but smooth. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its people embittered. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged to terrorize newly freed Black Americans. Black codes and later Jim Crow laws would institutionalize racism for another century. Even in the North, equality was far from reality. The Civil War had freed 4 million people, but it had not guaranteed them justice. And yet, something profound had changed. The United States was now a nation indivisible, with a central government empowered to uphold liberty. The age of states threatening to leave the Union was over. The modern American nation-state was born. Its industrial economy, no longer tethered to slavery, exploded with growth. Steel, oil, electricity, and railroads powered America's rise. By the early 20th century, the U.S. would become the world's economic superpower. But beneath the soaring skylines and golden promises, the ghosts of the war lingered. Racism, division, and questions of justice remained unsolved. Even today, over 150 years later, the Civil War continues to shape American identity. Its battlefields are preserved, its generals are debated. Its flag, in some corners, still flies. Open ending. The echoes of freedom. The Civil War ended with the sound of surrender, but its echoes never truly faded. What began as a struggle for union became a crucible for the meaning of freedom itself. Can a nation that enslaved millions truly be the land of liberty? Can a democracy born in contradiction ever be whole? And in an age where old divisions resurface in new forms, can the wounds of that war finally heal? These are not questions confined to history. They are Oliver Wright know in the choices a nation makes, in the ideals it honors, and in the truths it is still learning to face. Because history does not sleep. It only waits to be understood. Thank you for watching Legacy Files. If you believe history still speaks, still matters, and still warns, subscribe, and let's uncover it together.